Has anyone attempted to disprove the equivalence principle of physics? There may be mathematical equivalence, but not necessarily physical equivalence. What we call science today is a confirmatory exercise, so any approach that threatens confirmation of the established and accepted, i.e. any approach leading to actually disproving anything, is weeded out, and all controversy is just a show, ending always in, so far no dice, as David Chitikal says in his answer, reflecting a widely held belief. The equivalence principle is based on Galilean relativity, which was a desperate attempt to find a convincing argument for the indistinguishability between, i.e. the equivalence of the heliocentric and geocentric model, an attempt so flawed logically that the church, well trained in logic, did not buy it. It was Galileo versus Aristotle, and Galileo, nicknamed the Wrangler at university, was not shy to take it up with the old master.
When a rock is allowed to fall to the ground from a tall tower, it is observed to land at the foot of the tower. If the Earth was moving through space while the rock was falling, then it should land in a different place.
The vertical path of a falling object does not compel one to the conclusion that the Earth is stationary.
Galileo argues the following in typical Wrangler fashion. Drop a rock from the top of the mast of a ship. Whether the ship is at rest or moving with a constant velocity, the rock always lands, he says, just at the foot of the mast. Thus, an observation of the point of impact on a deck reveals nothing, he says, of the ship's state of motion. In an analogy to that, a rock drop from the top of a tower thus does not reveal, he says, the state of Earth's motion. This is the kind of rhetoric for which Galileo was actually expelled from university, because it ruined the cognitive capacities of his colleagues and thus the educative goals of the prestigious institute. We have bought into this for all too long, and it's time to expel Galileo again. Galileo mixes two arguments and two situations while clandestinely making one unjustified point, that we cannot empirically experience any motion of the Earth. First is the argument that a rock always lands next to the mast when dropped from next to the mast, independent of the motion of the ship. Second is the argument that a man on shore has a different visual perspective. When the boat is relatively at rest in port, the man drops a stone from the mast. The stone appears to both of the relatively stationary observers, the man and the girl, to fall straight down, and it lands near the foot of the mast. After the boat leaves port and begins to sail at a uniform speed straight ahead, the man drops another stone from the top of the mast. The stone again lands near the foot of the moving mast, and to the observers on board, who share the same common lateral inertial motion as the ship and the stone, it appears like it fell straight down. Why? Because the body of reference for the observers on board is the uniformly moving boat and its mast, not the relatively stationary water. The stone falls along a vertical path that is moving with the ship. However, for the man on the shore who has a different visual perspective and a different body of reference, the shore and water which are at rest relative to the moving boat, and who does not share the same common inertial motion with the boat, the man on the mast, and the stone, the trajectory of the falling stone appears to be curving forward relative to the boat. Why? Because the man on the shore has a different perspective, and his reference body is the relatively stationary shore and water, not the uniformly moving boat and mast. Question: which observation is correct? Answer: the perception of each observer is relative to his position, his perspective, his reference body. The first argument is taken from a stationary flat Earth situation, because only on a stationary flat Earth, the top of the mast has the same velocity as the bottom, and that is v equals 0 for standing and v top equals v bottom for moving. The second argument is simply not true, because of course the man on shore also sees the rock drop along the mast and not the path as depicted. The dotted line is a projection onto a virtual stationary canvas, and this projection is the same for the mariner on the boat as it is for the man ashore. It is a matter of choice, a matter of reference, not a matter of physics. And now Galileo moves the whole scenario over to a rotating, orbiting Earth without acknowledging the dynamic differences, which he wants us to believe aren't there, but they are, of course. On a spherical rotating platform, the top of the mast as well as the top of the tower have a different tangential velocity, v equals w times r plus h for the top, r plus h versus v equals w times r for the bottom, r. Because momentum is conserved and tangential velocity is independent of radial acceleration, the rock, starting with a higher tangential velocity, will, by conservation of momentum, land forward of the mast and not, as Galileo claims, right next to it. Add to that during a trip north along a meridian, due to the inevitable velocity gradient of a rotating sphere, the ship's east to west tangential velocity drops during the fall of the rock, and thus the distance from the mast where it lands increases even more. In that manner, one could in principle determine exactly the location and state of motion on the ship. Thus, Galileo's statement, "The vertical path of a falling object does not compel one to the conclusion that the Earth is stationary," is simply wrong. Galileo counts on the differences being too small to measure and the intellect of the public too weak to recognize the ruse. But that doesn't change the fact that the principle he proposes is fundamentally flawed. This fundamental flaw of reasoning is then carried straight over to Einstein in his line of argumentation, which, in view of it being made in the 20th century and coming from the prestigious Max Planck Institute, becomes nothing less than embarrassing. Like Galileo's guy on the shore, here the outside observer will of course not see something like this, as the article claims. Watch the animation here, the equivalence principle and the deflection of light, and try not to laugh out loud watching the light actually being depicted as doing this. Let's have a closer look at how exactly physics professors willingly or unwillingly teach you nonsense. Below is given one of the hundreds of flawed illustrations available in textbooks used to trick you into believing this kind of nonsensical stuff. If we take the entrance of light at time t1 and the exit of light at time t2, then obviously the illustration represents time t2. But the guy holding the light is still represented as standing at time t1. At time t2, the elevator obviously has also moved past the guy holding the light, which would now be right opposite the exit point. Also, the light's path after exiting is not depicted, which would be a straight line, of course, and not continuing the parabola like in the silly animation presented by the Max Planck Institute. And thus, the entire scenario would rather look like this. Light travels always in a straight line, and only the projected trace, an abstract, not a real itinerary, may seem curved. Make your own experiment. Take a ruler, a pencil, and a piece of paper, place the ruler over the paper, and begin to draw a line. Ask a friend to pull the paper in one or the other direction. Watch the trace outline a diagonal for constant velocity, or a curve for accelerated pulling of the paper. Ask yourself if the outline trace represents the actual itinerary of an object. You will find it does not. The only real paths traveled are two rectilinear orthogonal motions. Nothing is curved, and therefore light does not fall in gravity, which is the silly and unphysical idea this flawed thought experiment tries to convey and push through. Gravity and elevator have physically nothing to do with each other. This is complete nonsense, and therefore Einstein can only make it work in the infinitesimal, which is not physical reality. Therefore, like Galileo, Einstein's statement,
"And in the discussion that follows, we shall therefore assume the complete physical equivalence of a gravitational field and a corresponding acceleration of the reference system,"
is simply wrong. Again, it is counted on the public being beholden to the authority of their teachers instead of trusting their own intellect to push through such asinine notions. When Einstein tried to apply his elevator concept to the real world, he could not but admit failure.
"It is, for instance, impossible to choose a body of reference such that, as judged from it, the gravitational field of the Earth vanishes,"
which he would need to be able to show if he were to uphold his postulate.
"That no experiment, no clever exploitation of the laws of physics can tell us whether we are accelerating in free space or in a gravitational field."
Therefore, Einstein had to relegate the entirety of relativity into the unphysical realm of the infinitesimal.
"Within an infinitely small space-time region, one can always find a reference frame, an infinitely small elevator cabin observed over an infinitely brief period of time in which the laws of physics are the same in special relativity."
This is an unscientific statement, because if you cannot observe it and measure it, it is wild speculation. In this case, it is also wildly irrational, whereas rationality is another cornerstone of science. This, together with my last several posts where I've shown that Newton pulled your leg with a postulated fall of the moon of 14 millimeters per second, and Kepler duped you with the unphysical notion of a constant aerial velocity, is now the 20th century equivalent of this kind of cheap deception, all geared to maintain a totally made up and physically untenable cosmological model. In answer to the question, since Copernicus, everything has been mathematical, nothing has been physical. In the preface to his De Revolutionibus, Copernicus admonishes us that It is all about computation, not about physics.
So far as hypotheses are concerned, let no one expect anything certain from astronomy, which cannot furnish it, lest he accept the truth ideas conceived for another purpose, and depart from this study a greater fool than when he entered it. Farewell.
We have all become the greater fools Copernicus refers to, because we take for truth something that has been conceived for another purpose, and that is the purpose of computing, not the purpose of making statements about physics.